David Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to On Politics. I'm joined in studio this week by Dan Bice. Dan, thanks for being here.
Hey.
Dan's a columnist for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and we'll be joined via Skype in just a moment by Jason Stein, a reporter at our Madison Bureau, and from Washington by Craig Gilbert, our Washington Bureau Chief. But first, let's talk about what we'll talk about this week. Let's check the headlines. First, is this the end of the Never Trump movement? We'll talk to Craig Gilbert in Washington about that after the primaries on Tuesday. Next, we'll talk about Russ Feingold and his PAC, Progressives United, which seems to be funding one candidate more than the others. We'll talk about Justice David Prosser of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, who is retiring, and the opening that gives to Governor Scott Walker. We'll talk about problem landlords in Milwaukee after a disturbing series of stories this week by Kevin Crow and Carrie Spivak. We'll talk with them. And finally, winners and losers and our viewers' questions. But first, let's go to Craig Gilbert in Washington. And I'm joined now by Craig Gilbert, the Journal Sentinel's Washington Bureau Chief. Craig, thanks for being with us.
Great to be with you.
So let me ask you about this. Is the Never Trump movement dead?
Yeah, it's on its very, very, very last legs. And I think you're going to see an all-out effort in Indiana the way you saw an all-out effort in Wisconsin. It may not be as promising or as fruitful as the Stop Trump effort was in Wisconsin, but that's where the Trump opposition is marshaling its forces for one big last push. If Ted Cruz loses in Indiana, then it truly, indisputably is over.
Yeah, it's tough for him mathematically to have a chance after that, right? Because Trump is leading in the other states. California.
Yeah, mathematically he can survive Indiana because California is a big state with lots of delegates. So if you think that he's going to do really well in California, then yeah, he can still mathematically do it. But it's not just a math problem. It's also, this is politics. And so when it gets to a point where one candidate is a lot closer than another candidate and is moving in the right direction, and it's late in the race, there's so many forces that combine to try to bring this to a resolution within the party. If Donald Trump were a normal candidate, you would have seen this happen already by now.
Quite a while ago. Right.
But he's not a normal candidate, and so there's enough resistance at all levels within the party that has dragged this thing out longer than it otherwise would have been dragged out.
So what do you make, Craig, of Ted Cruz today saying that he would name Carly Fiorina his vice presidential choice? Is this a Hail Mary?
It is a bit of a Hail Mary. I mean, it's partly to gain attention at a time when Donald Trump has got momentum and he's coming off these big victories and he's acting like the winner. It's partly to try to just change things up and maybe take advantage of Donald Trump's weakness with women, among other things. So he's pulling out all the stops. Even
Republican women, right? Trump has a problem even with Republican women.
Yes, he does he does worse with Republican women than with Republican men. His numbers with women overall are pretty bad, and it's partly a gender issue for him and partly just the fact that women tend to lean more Democratic. It's kind of similar to his problems with young voters, which are pretty sizable in that it's a Democratic-leaning group, but they also really, really don't like Donald Trump.
Yeah. And what if Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side? She's just about wrapped it up now. Bernie Sanders is laying off campaign workers, we hear today. But her favorability ratings, in fact, Trump's too, are very low. What can either of them do between now and the fall to work on that? What are we going to see in the fall, given how poor they are?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way for them to kind of move their numbers is to consolidate their parties, and that's hard to do when you're in the middle of a competition. So I think we can imagine Hillary Clinton consolidating Democratic support when she's the nominee. That will improve her numbers, but her big problem, just as it's Donald Trump's big problem, is with independents, and they both have pretty bad numbers among independents. That's a harder battle, and presidential campaigns are a zero-sum game when it's a two-party race. And so if Donald Trump's problem with independents is even worse than Hillary Clinton's problem with independents, that's obviously good for Hillary Clinton, but they both have a real problem there.
And talking about ratings, you're working on a story on Paul Ryan's ratings. What are you finding?
Well, I wanted to take a look at his polling numbers in Wisconsin and in southeastern Wisconsin because he has a primary opponent now, Paul Nehlen, who's been endorsed by a big Tea Party group this week, to see whether there were any signs of vulnerability there. I mean, you don't see big signs of vulnerability in Paul Ryan's numbers in Wisconsin. I mean, he is very favorable numbers among Republicans and Republican leaners, both statewide and in southeastern Wisconsin. Maybe they're not quite as great as they were a few months ago, and not quite as great as they were when he was the vice presidential nominee, but they're pretty good. And so that ought to be comforting to him. What's more interesting about his numbers to me is that in a very polarized age and landscape that we live in, Wisconsin's a very polarized state, Paul Ryan's numbers have not really polarized since he became speaker the way they did when he joined the presidential ticket as Mitt Romney's running mate. And there you just saw his numbers go up among Republicans and go right down among liberals and Democrats and even moderates. But he's got really good numbers among moderates for a Republican in this day and age. And they've actually improved since he became speaker. And his numbers among liberals and Democrats, while they're quite negative as you would expect, they're not nearly as negative as other high-profile Republicans, and they're not as negative as they used to be. So that sort of tells you that it hasn't been a polarizing speakership for Paul Ryan so far. That could easily change because of the nature of the job.
Right. Anything you can attribute that to? I think it's really interesting that his numbers actually look a little bit better since he became speaker. I wouldn't have thought that.
I would attribute that partly to his tone, and also he's positioned himself as an occasional critic of Donald Trump, which I think goes over well with some moderates and certainly with liberals and Democrats. I think his tone and tonally, he's just tried to be sort of a civil guy and not a bomb thrower. And even though his politics and his policies are very, very conservative, I don't think that's what's defining him right now because, among other things, the House isn't doing a whole lot. I think what's defining him is his rhetoric and his tone. A few years ago, it was his budget, which really was polarizing. But now it's his rhetoric and his tone, and I think that's why you see his numbers look very different in their profile than, for example, Governor Walker's, who's, if anything, more popular among Republicans than Paul Ryan is, but doesn't have the numbers Paul Ryan has among moderates and independents, and is, considerably more unpopular among liberals and Democrats than Paul Ryan is.
Well, one last question, going back to Donald Trump for just a minute. His new campaign advisor, Paul Manafort, says he's going to become more presidential. Can Trump really make people forget some of the things that he said in this campaign? Well,
the two problems there are the one you raised, which is can he make people forget what he said, and can he even do it? I mean, I went up to see Trump in Pennsylvania a few days ago. And that was the same day, mind you, that Paul Manafort was telling members of the RNC that his candidate was going to become more presidential. And not only was Trump the same old Donald Trump in terms of his rhetoric and tone, but he was openly making fun of the idea that he should become more presidential. He was telling his crowds that, hey, I could become more presidential and you'd all disappear and it wouldn't get me anywhere. And this is what's gotten me this far. I still have some fighting to do. And he just scoffed openly at the whole notion and made fun of the idea that presidential candidates ought to be presidential.
Well, I guess we'll have to see. Craig Gilbert, thanks so much.
Until next time.
Now I'm back with Daniel Bice, and we're joined by Jason Stein via Skype in Madison. We're going to talk first about a story, Dan, that you did this week on Russ Feingold and Progressives United, a PAC that he formed, a year or two ago, maybe longer.
Yeah, he set it up after he lost to Ron Johnson.
After he lost, it's been almost 6 years.
In 2011. And so it was this period between 2011 and actually the PAC is still operating. It was a PAC and a nonprofit. He set up two things. Basically, it allowed him to stay in the political game. They said that they would be helping candidates, progressive candidates like Bernie Sanders. They gave money to him. They gave money to Tammy Baldwin, to Elizabeth Warren. And last year I wrote a story about what they actually did, and they spent 2/3 of their money on fundraising, and about 5% of their money ended up going directly to candidates. And their response was, this is a different sort of PAC. They were mobilizing grassroots and trying to tell them who to vote for. Right. So more recently, I decided to see if there was any connection between his campaign and Progressives United. Right. And so I went to 3 particular areas. One, staff members. So Progressives United had 10 staff members. 8 of them end up moving to his campaign.
Right. Pretty strong connection there.
Right. And their point is there are 25 people on the campaign, but these people hold pretty important titles with the campaign. Yeah. 2, he kept the 3 main fundraising entities, the direct mail firm, the telemarketing firm, and the online firm. And they just picked up where they stopped with Progressives United. And then I wanted to see if Progressive United donors gave money to his campaign. And the amount isn't a great deal. It's $290,000 that we were able to document so far. But it does turn out that it's more money than Progressives United gave directly to liberal candidates during its 5-year run. So
was this just set up to get Russ Feingold elected to the Senate again?
Well, I said it's benefit that he's been the primary beneficiary of Progressives United, right, whether that was the intent or not. And I'll leave that to the campaigns to debate. Johnson's campaign says, yes, of course he set it up as a slush fund and that he wanted to take advantage of this as a candidate. And the Feingold people say it's hard to document whether there was any benefit to the campaign. So whether there was intentional, I didn't get into that so much. I was more interested in just trying to say what are the facts on this matter.
So what does the Feingold campaign say to the charge that here's the guy who led the fight, McCain-Feingold, for campaign finance reform, and now he's basically raising all this money?
Part of what they say is, and you put each of these things in context. 8 employees, they've got 25, so 8's only a third. These 3 firms, it's not unusual that you stick with these firms because they're really good. And then the $290,000 represents like 5% of their income. So those are their responses. And then they also say, hey, Russ could have set up a super PAC, and he didn't. This was better than a super PAC. And then they point at Johnson and say, he's the one with 3 super PACs backing him.
All right.
So it's a diversionary thing.
Yeah, okay. Well, Jason, let me come to you next. And I'd like to talk about David Prosser retiring from the state Supreme Court. Scott Walker gets another opening, another appointment. How's that going to work? First of all, walk us through what happens next.
Right. So David Prosser, who was elected in 2011, could have served a 10-year term till 2021. He's not going to do that. He said he's going to retire on July 31st after the court gets done hearing all its cases in the current session. And what happens is there's a new election held. Scott Walker will appoint David Prosser's successor, and then that person will have an option of running for the court seat in 2020, which is the first spring election we're going to have that doesn't already have a court election scheduled.
I wondered about that. So that's how that works. That's why we have to wait till 2020. Okay.
Correct.
All right. Great.
So again, this is Scott Walker's opportunity to, for the second time, put his thumbprint on the court. He appointed Rebecca Bradley last fall. She was elected earlier this month in her own right, and will now serve a 10-year term. And he'll be able to do that with another potential appointee to the court. In Wisconsin, the Senate does not need to confirm that person, so that person will become a member of the state's highest court as soon as he names them.
Okay, Dan, let me turn to you. What would you say David Prosser's legacy is on the court? He's been on the court he will have been 18 years, right?
Right. His legacy on the court is, he's part of the conservative group on the court, but I don't think that he's as hard to the right as some of the others. There was a case earlier this year on a Fourth Amendment case, a search and seizure case, where he joined with Ann Walsh Bradley and Shirley Abramson to create the minority. It was actually a 3-3 vote, and then Rebecca Bradley gets in on the case. So I think he is the most independent of the current conservatives on the court right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, let me come back to you. What do you had in your article yesterday, I guess this morning, a couple of candidates that are already being touted. Talk about them and how you see that.
Sure. Well, there'll obviously be a process in which Governor Walker will have a selection committee that will take people nominating themselves or other people and go through those and forward candidates to the governor, who will typically interview them and then make a choice. Some of the names that are already being thrown around are Mark Gundrum, an appeals court judge who was formerly a state assemblyman who was very involved in the Judiciary Committee. You have Brian Hagedorn, who was a former chief counsel to the governor and was appointed by the governor to be a appellate court justice as well. Then you have some other names that are possibilities, like Michael Brennan, who's in charge of the governor's judicial selection committee. And then you have even J.B. Van Hollen, a former state attorney general, being thrown out there. Although since Van Hollen is already registered as a lobbyist for Facebook, that can be one sign that someone who's been in public life is now no longer looking to run for elected office.
Right. I think when you're talking about Prosser, you have to talk about his legacy, not just as a Supreme Court justice, but as a Republican leader in the state. He became the Assembly Speaker in 1995, and that was a time when Republicans hadn't been in power for a long time, and he was able to shepherd things through and help push through the Republican agenda there, and then he joined and becomes part of the Republican majority. I think over the last 25 years, he's been at the forefront of what the conservatives in Wisconsin are all about.
So a singular figure for Republicans in the state of Wisconsin. Well, let's move now to an article that Kevin Crow and Carrie Spivak worked on. We're going to talk to them on landlords in Milwaukee. So now I'm joined with Carrie Spivak, a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and Kevin Crow, another reporter. And you guys worked on a great project on landlords in Milwaukee. And I just want to read the top of the opening day story. It's about Will Sherrard, one of Milwaukee's most notorious landlords. He faced 100 building code violations for a vast array of infractions. More than 4 years later, he still owes almost $40,000 of those fines. And yet at the same time, Sherrard and his Morocco Investments LLC paid more than $600,000 in cash to buy 63 more homes and duplexes, and now some of those properties are racking up fines. So this is the essence of what you were reporting. So Carrie, what's the big takeaway here?
Basically, you could owe the city a whole lot of money, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, and for building code violations. And if you don't want to pay them, you're going to get away with it.
And get away.
In Will Sherrard's case, he has an agreement where he pays nominal amounts. He's paying about $100 every 90 days or so on fines. The total amount was $45,000, three $10,000 fines, and then two smaller fines. And then there's other guys who pay nothing at all. And even if an arrest warrant is issued, it doesn't mean a whole lot because you have to have 4 interactions with the cops, speeding tickets, what have you, and all you're going to get is a court date, and then on the 5th time they might actually arrest you. So if you don't pay, it don't matter, basically.
So Kevin, why can you keep buying properties if you have this kind of history?
Well, I mean, there's nothing to stop these guys from buying properties. Okay. So, I mean, there's nothing in state law or even local law that says, you can't go to a sheriff's sale and buy properties. I mean, essentially the only real condition there is that you have cash or a cashier's check. That's what it is. And so these guys have kind of figured out, a few of them anyway, that they can go and get, kind of properties at bargain basement prices, not maybe fix them up a bunch. I mean, they'll rack up code violations and delinquent taxes. And then if they end up not wanting to keep the property, they can just totally not pay their taxes. And after a few years, the city will pull a tax foreclosure on the house and wipe the tax debt clean.
Right.
So.
And what were a couple of the more egregious things that you saw in terms of houses and problems with houses?
Well, there was one that's owned by a different landlord. Elijah Muhammad Rashid it's another problem. He's the registered agent for more than 20 limited liability corporations that rent out properties. And there was this one house that we went to. The basement had so much mold on the ceiling that both myself and the photographer, when we left, we still had that taste in our mouths for several hours.
Oh,
she
man.
had windows that you can't open. The storm door had no window, no glass window, nor screen, so you really couldn't use the storm door. So you couldn't let air in on a nice day. That was one of the worst, but there's lots of properties like that. And he rented it out without having an occupancy permit because there had been a fire there a couple of years earlier.
Yeah, so imagine living in that. So Kevin and Carrie both. Kevin, let me start with you. What could be done to ensure that these kinds of things don't happen?
Well, one of the things that the city does with the properties that it takes through tax foreclosure is, in order to buy a property from the city, they kind of do a check on you. And so they say, all right, this person doesn't owe the city delinquent property taxes or doesn't owe muni court fees. And so they've set up kind of a few basic barriers, or kind of a few basic checkpoints to look for people who are buying properties. And that is one of the things that they're going to be proposing for the state level.
That's not being done now, though.
That's not being done. Well, it's done by the city, but it's not being done for sheriff sales. So sheriff sales are mortgage foreclosures or lender foreclosures, and then the city takes properties through tax foreclosure. So the city actually handles the sale of its own properties, but the sheriff's office, and I mean, they don't really have any control over this. I mean, it's through state law, but they handle all of the mortgage foreclosures.
And finally, is there any political fallout here? Has the mayor's office heard about this? Are aldermen hearing about it as a result of your reporting? What do you hear?
There's been some, and the mayor has already working with the city attorney's office. They're talking to the judges about setting up a system so that when somebody comes in and says, "Judge, I need more time to make the payments," right now they do that. There's no city attorney there, no prosecutor to say, "Hey, wait a minute, this guy's every Monday's at the sheriff's sales. He has money, make him pay his fines."
Right.
They're going to start being notified so they can raise objections. Several aldermen who we called did not get back to us, although another reporter, Mary Spikuza, called Ashanti Hamilton, the new council president, and he was talking about this is a concern and that you should not be allowed to go buy new properties while you have all these fines hanging over your head. In the State House, Governor Walker said it's serious, he'll look into it. City officials aren't real confident there.
Right.
But there is some talk among legislators that they see a problem and something has to be done, but right now they don't have a clue as to what it is.
So are you guys doing some more reporting on this? Are we likely to see some more stories?
Yes.
Okay. Well, more to come on that. Carrie Spivak and Kevin Crow, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Thanks for joining us. And now it's time for winners and losers. Dan, your winner.
My winner is Justice Prosser. We were just talking about him. I've known him for 25 years. I've been through some, decent stories, fun stories, and I've seen, his very angry side as well. But he gets to leave the court on his own terms.
All right. Jason?
My winner in this case would be Scott Walker, and I think because he gets this choice on the court. And again, I think this is a true winner in that, there's not anyone who can take this nominee back from him. He doesn't need a Senate appointment, and it will be several years before the nominee will have to stand for election.
All right, Jason, let's stay with you. Who's your loser of the week?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders is sort of the loser of the campaign on the Democratic side. He's laying off some staffers, quite a few staffers. And, obviously his supporters will continue to talk him up as a possibility. But I think mathematics is increasingly coming into play here in the Democratic primary.
And Dan, your loser of the week?
Is Alderman Kovac. He, I do these winners and losers the day after election, and this didn't become apparent until just recently that, in the shakeup where Ashanti Hamilton takes over the Common Council, Kovac was very instrumental in trying to help candidates run against Mark Borkowski, Tony Zielinski, and Bob Donovan. The only problem is they all lost all those three, and so these three aldermen merged with the Black Caucus, and they now have control over the Common Council, and Kovac loses his position as head of finance and ends up as just a member of two of the minor committees.
Okay, Nick Kovac, loser of the week, according to Dan Bice. Let's go to reader questions next, and Dan, you're up. So you wrote a blog post this week about Sheriff Clark and a run-in he had with Wonder Woman.
I wrote a lot of things about Sheriff Clark this week. He had a fun time in New York last week.
He did, but shouldn't you be labeled according to, no, this is not Sheriff Clark, it's Don. Shouldn't you be labeled a gossip columnist?
Well, I did take something from Page 6, which is a gossip page. This week I also took something from SB Nation, which is a sports page. So I guess that would make me a sports columnist if I do that. But it was just a fun little item. And in fact, as a result of that thing, we ended up getting a selfie by Linda Carter, Wonder Woman, and David Clark backstage of Fox News.
Jason, here's one for you from Martha. She wants to know when we might next, and that would be you, I think, or Patrick Marley in Madison, take a deeper dive into the effects of Governor Walker's refusal to take Medicaid funds.
That's an interesting question. I mean, we continue to report on that issue. We've reported on it many times. My colleague Guy Bolton, the health reporter, has also written about it. It will certainly come up in the next budget when new numbers will come out about, what the state could have done in terms of covering people and receiving more federal funds. And it also, you revisit this issue as you look at other states and their experiences, whether this has been as effective in terms of the expansion as proponents of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act had hoped. So, we'll continue to write about that. Martha need to have no worry on that account.
It'll come up again. So let me ask you both this question. Any guesses as to who Donald Trump might pick for his vice presidential nominee? As you know, Carly Fiorina is the pick of Ted Cruz.
She appears to be taken in terms of a potential running mate.
Right, so it can't be Carly Fiorina.
And when you lose 5 primaries, people want to know who your vice presidential candidate is going to be.
Right.
So,
right. So he said the writer suggests Clint Eastwood. I think that was in jest, although I'm not sure 100%.
Jason, you got any guesses on that one?
I do not. I do not. I'm gonna. Discretion is the better part of valor.
You're taking a pass, and that's okay.
Well, there are 2 things. One, he did mention Scott Walker, and Scott Walker said he did literally laugh out loud when he saw that. and then 2. The one thing that's interesting about it is the delegates have to actually approve who the nominee is for vice president. And there's a possibility that if Trump is the nominee, that the delegates might not go along with the person he chooses. I mean, they have traditionally, but if you have a very strong anti-Trump feeling fervor among the delegates, they could very easily reject that person and push for somebody else.
All right, we're going to leave it there. That's another On Politics. I've been joined by Dan Bice in studio, by Jason Stein in Madison, and Craig Gilbert in Washington, D.C. Have a great week.